Let me now introduce our speaker tonight. She's Susannah Calderan. She's a marine ecologist and honorary research fellow at the Scottish Association of Marine Science. She specializes in acoustic studies on whales and the impact of human activities on whales, such as ship strikes, underwater noise, and fisheries bycatch. Her works in acoustics has involved several Antarctic and subantarctic research projects investigating blue whales with the British Antarctic Survey and Australian Antarctic Division. She has been involved in blue whale research in Sri Lanka for several years with a primary focus on resolving the blue whale ship strike problem. Without further ado, let me invite Susannah to speak to us for the next hour. Susannah, welcome.
Thank you very much. Right, I'm assuming everybody can see my screen all right here. Thank you very much for inviting me to talk to you this evening. It's a great pleasure to be able to talk to you, and I'm very happy to be here. Firstly, I'd like to say that the work that we've been doing on ship strikes in Sri Lanka has been highly collaborative, and I'm just here representing my colleagues. Those colleagues on ship strike work that we've been doing are, you can see their logos all along the bottom, the University of Ruhuna, Raja in the Wales, the Biospheres Foundation, I4, the International Fund for Animal Welfare, St Andrews University, the International Whaling Commission, and the World Shipping Council. And I'd like to acknowledge all those people, and I'm just here on everybody else's behalf. So, as Graham said, I'm a whale biologist. I've been studying whales for over 20 years, and my main focus is on blue whales, acoustics, and anthropogenic impacts, so human impacts on whales and on their environment. And so I'll be talking to you here this evening from the perspective of a blue whale scientist. I'm not a policy maker or an expert in shipping, and I'm certainly not an expert in Sri Lanka like probably everybody else is here. So I will certainly just talk about our perspective on the ship strike issue in Sri Lanka, but also ship strike issues in the rest of the world, because it's not just Sri Lanka that's got a problem with ship strikes on large whales. There are problems in several areas of the world, and I'll be talking a little bit about what they've done to address those problems. So collisions with ships or ship strikes are recognised as a very serious conservation and welfare problem for Sri Lankan whales, but also so other whales around the world. And already blue whale populations, all blue whale populations around the world, are considered to be endangered and are likely to only a small fraction of their natural numbers because of past commercial whaling. And that does include Northern Indian Ocean whales. So they're all recovering populations anyway. And so further anthropogenic threats can be quite a problem for them. So we're going to look this evening at how ship strikes are a welfare and conservation problem for large whales, and how we can understand them, and then how can we do something about mitigating those problems. So the current threats to large whales globally, mostly whaling, commercial whaling has stopped. There are some countries in the world that do still whale commercially, but mostly whaling has stopped commercially. And so the main threats now to whales are unintended threats. So ship strikes is a big one. So there are ship strike problems in places such as Sri Lanka, California, and the Northeast Atlantic. So, for example, the Bay of Biscay and the Gulf of St. Lawrence. More of a sublethal threat is underwater noise from ships and seismic surveys and other industrial activities. So a lot of these noises are low frequency, and that's the bandwidth that large whales communicate in. And so a lot of anthropogenic noise in the environment, underwater noise, can reduce the communication space that whales have in order to communicate with each other. And that's something I've very much noticed when I've been doing acoustic surveys. When you're in areas where there's a lot of anthropogenic noise, such as shipping noise or seismic noise, you can't hear the whales yourself. So, they will also have trouble hearing each other. Another big threat to large whales is entanglement in fishing gear. And mostly the fishing gear we're talking about is lobster pots, creels, so bottom set static gear, mostly for crustacea. And where I live and work in northwest Scotland, that's a particular problem here, entanglement in lobster pot gear for minke whales and humpback whales mainly here. So that's an issue in several parts of the world. But particularly this evening, I'm going to be talking about ship strikes and the issues that they pose to large whales. So ship strikes, it's reasonably self-explanatory. They're collisions between ships and whales, and they can occur anywhere where the distribution of whales and ships overlaps. Many ship strikes result in death or serious injury to the whale. Now, in many cases, whales are actually quite good at avoiding ships, but they sometimes don't manage to. And probably there's some learning involved in whether whales know how to avoid ships, because calves and juvenile animals are the most commonly reported struck animals. So it seems like if they survive past being youngsters, then they do actually learn how to avoid ships better, perhaps. The main factor that increases risk of a vessel strike is the speed. So faster ships have higher collision rates and they cause greater injury if there is a collision. Most large ships are actually unaware that they've hit a whale. So only a small fraction of incidents are noticed and even a smaller fraction are reported. So sometimes the ship will come into port with a whale over the bulbous bow of the ship, and then it will become apparent that they've hit a whale. But a lot of the time they don't know. Depending on the prevailing currents of the area where the whale has been hit, then maybe the whales just drift out to sea or sink and never come ashore. So we know about a really quite small proportion of whales that have been hit by ships. Because we want to increase how much we know about ship strikes and what the risks are, and how we can do something about mitigating ship strikes, the International Whaling Commission, which does global research on whales, has been developing a global database of ship strike incidents. So this allows people to enter details if they themselves have hit a whale, or they know about a ship strike incident, or they've read about one in a newspaper and they want to make sure that it's documented and it's logged. And so it helps to identify high-risk areas. It helps to identify factors related to risk, such as speed, such as ship type, and those together help to provide information on how we might be able to mitigate some of these risks of ship strikes to whales. So the other important organisation to be aware of when we're thinking about ship strikes is the International Maritime Organization. So this is a global body responsible for regulating shipping. And the IMO has a number of relevant guidelines for establishing shipping routes, and it's developed specific guidance on measures that can be taken to reduce ship strikes to whales. So first, we'll look at some areas that have got a ship strike problem and have a look at what some of those areas are doing about it. So there's some rather horrible images here, which I apologise for, of stranded sperm whales in the Hellenic Trench in Greece, which have all been hit by ships, and that's their cause of death. There's only about 200 or 300 sperm whales in the Eastern Mediterranean population, and it's a very, very busy shipping area. So, as I was saying, often we only know about collisions from stranded whales, and out of 24 stranded sperm whales examined between 1992 and 2018 in the Hellenic Trench, 13 carcasses showed that whales had propeller marks or cuts that only a ship strike could have made, and 3 more cases were probable ship strikes. This is probably the tip of the iceberg because there's a lot of carcasses that won't ever strand. So the main ships causing the problem in this area are container ships and general cargo ships going between ports in the Mediterranean. So following these results, the IWC, the International Whaling Commission, listed the Hellenic Trench as among 4 ship strike areas of particular concern at a global level. So what can you do about it? Well, usually whales are in a particular place because they want to be, because it's a good feeding area for them. Whales have homes like the rest of us do. So you can't move the whales. The whales are where they are. So you have to look at how you can mitigate the problems with the ships. And so keeping whales and ships apart has been seen as one of the best ways of doing this. And there are several areas in the world where they've done this already. So if we look at the map on the left-hand side, this is the Bay of Fundy in Canada. And you can see there's a box with some blue dots in it, and that's an area of high distribution of right whales. And there they have rerouted the ships. So the new shipping route you can see is the brown and white lines, and they've rerouted the ships to go round this area of high right whale distribution. And so they've moved the whales away from where the ships are. And if you look at the map on the right, this is the approaches to Boston in the USA. And again, you can see the red hot bits are areas, high use whale habitats. And the dashed line is a new shipping lane that they implemented to go between those high use areas, which replaces the full black lines, which used to go through areas of very high whale density. So they haven't moved the shipping lanes by very much, but it's made quite a difference in terms of it not going through high use whale habitat. Now, the other way that is discussed about mitigating the problem of ship strikes is slowing ships down, which definitely does help. And that has been implemented in some areas as well. But often shipping companies aren't so keen on doing that. And it often adds quite a lot of time to their journey. And slowing down doesn't necessarily reduce other safety concerns. So sometimes it's something you can also put into the mix, is slowing ships down, but keeping whales and ships apart is often seen as the best way. So here's another example. This is Panama. And the shipping lanes in the approaches to the Panama Canal have also been moved to reduce risks to humpback whales. So here you can see the darker blue shading shows important areas for whales, with small changes to the shipping routes minimising the number of ships passing through the high density areas. So the pink lines are the shipping routes which have been established, and they keep the ships further offshore. And this was done by the Panamanian government in cooperation with the International Maritime Organization in 2014. So they used an IMO-approved process. So there's actually also speed restriction here as well. You can see the 8-degree north line, and north of that, ships have to slow down to 10 knots as well. And that thick pink line is the traffic separation scheme going into the Panama Canal. So that's quite a recent new shipping scheme that the Panamanian government took to the IMO, and it's been implemented to protect humpback whales. Now, if we think back to the sperm whales in Greece in the Hellenic Trench that I was talking about, now currently nothing has been done there yet. The Greek government needs to come forward with a proposal. But what's under discussion, as you can see the purple shading, those lines indicate the density of shipping, and those red dots are sperm whale locations from acoustic and visual surveys. So the researchers involved have suggested shipping should avoid the areas within those yellow lines that you can see, either through an areas to be avoided designation or through a new traffic separation scheme. There's no traffic separation scheme there at the moment. So that is something that the Greek government will have to take to IMO if they want a traffic separation scheme implemented, like the Panamanian government did with their new shipping lanes. So because we're particularly talking about blue whales this evening, here's an example of measures that have been taken to protect blue whales. And this is of California. So blue whales are vulnerable to ship strikes in several areas. And reported strike rates off California are particularly high, although it is worth noting at this point that the density of shipping and whales in California is less than it is off Sri Lanka. So the US presented a proposal to IMO in 2012 for minor changes to the shipping lane to avoid the highest concentration of whales. So this area of California is extremely complex. There's a lot of conflicting activities. There's shipping, there's naval activities, there's oil and gas, and there are limited navigational options between the Channel Islands and the Californian coast. So it's very difficult to try and move the ships away from the high density whale areas. But they did actually manage to do it. They didn't move the shipping lane very far, but they have managed to do something. And there's also was a trial incentive program to slow ships down to 12 knots in the Santa Barbara Channel. So it's a complicated area of California, but they have done quite well in terms of trying to mitigate the problem there. So the IMO Environmental Committee has agreed that minor routing changes in high-risk areas was probably the best measure for reducing ship strikes and could lead to a substantial reduction in risk. And that is preferred over slowing down, and also addresses safety issues as well. And the shipping industry has indicated that small changes in routing are often acceptable. So it's something that the IMO and the shipping industry are quite keen on. And as we've seen in some of those previous examples, in some areas that has been possible and has really reduced the risk for whales. So if we move on to Sri Lanka now, so one of the highest risk areas identified by the International Whaling Commission for ship strikes is Sri Lanka, south of Sri Lanka, where there's very high density of blue whales and high density of shipping and a number of reported collisions. And you can see here a couple of photographs. I was talking earlier about whales getting caught on the bulbous bow of boats. And here you can see an example of that. It's usually the long, thin whales that this happens to. So species such as blue whales, fin whales, sei whales, Bryde's whales. The fatter whales, such as humpback whales or right whales, they do also get hit by ships, but because of their body shape, they tend not to end up draped over the bulbous bow. So here's a couple of examples from Ashtavos's paper, where you can see animals that have been struck by ships. Now, in terms of the severity of the problem, how many whales are actually getting hit by ships off Sri Lanka, it's complicated. The prevailing winds often mean that animals that are killed don't come ashore. Some that do get washed ashore get dealt with really quite quickly, so often don't get reported. And as I said before, most ships don't realise if they've hit a whale. Between 2010 and 2012, there were reports of 11 deaths of blue whales around Sri Lanka attributed to ship strikes. And there's a number of records from Sri Lankan scientists of blue whales being killed by ships. So we must have to assume that it's only a very small proportion of collisions that are reported or result in stranding. So when we were talking about California earlier, the estimated reporting rate for ship strike of blue whale deaths is less than 1 in 20. So most of the whales that are hit by ships off Sri Lanka and in most areas of the world, we never find out about. Now, there's been a threefold increase in shipping recently, and that is probably contributing to the high level of ship strikes. In the area south of Marissa, there's probably around 300 blue whales. That's the density that we've calculated from some surveys that we've done. And if they didn't all get out of the way, there would be about 1,000 collisions per year, some of them fatal. But obviously, as I've said, a lot of whales manage to get out of the way. But it's certainly an issue. I'm just going to talk for a couple of minutes about the blue whales that we see south of Sri Lanka and around the Sri Lankan coast. So they're Indian Ocean blue whales, and there are 4 distinct populations of Indian Ocean blue whales. And when I'm talking about populations, I don't mean it in a strictly taxonomic sense. So as I mentioned earlier, my area is acoustics, so I'm interested in whale vocalizations. And you can tell these different populations apart by their different song type. So they're all recognizable as blue whales from their song, but their song is different from each other. So around the world, you can tell different blue whale populations from each other. So for example, the ones that we have here in Scotland in the Northeast Atlantic sound different from the ones in the Antarctic, which sound different from ones in California, and so on and so forth. So there are different acoustic populations, and in the Indian Ocean, we can tell that there are 4 different types of vocalizers, but they probably cross over with each other. So around Sri Lanka, mainly they're seen off Mirissa and Trinco. The international community didn't really know very much about Sri Lanka's blue whales until the 1980s. But the Soviets certainly knew about them in the 1960s. At least 1,294 blue whales were killed in the Arabian Sea in illegal catches by the Soviet fleet between 1963 and 1966. And also some blue whales were taken off southern Sri Lanka and between Sri Lanka and the Maldives. But in terms of an awareness of blue whales off Sri Lanka, it's reasonably recent. They're present year-round off Trinco and Marissa. We have fewer data from the southwest monsoon time, but there are still upwellings there, and even though there's a very little whale watching, it does seem to be that there are whales there year-round. And during the northeast monsoon, there's, as I said, probably around maybe 300 off Marissa. The reason that they're there is it's an extremely biologically productive area. There's coastal upwelling, and along the 1,000-meter contour, there's very rich nutrients because of the bathymetry of the area. So these whales don't migrate. They're in the area year-round, and it's a consistently good area for them for feeding. So the other thing, unfortunately, that is also happening along the 1,000-meter contour is the traffic separation scheme. So you can see here, here's a map of Sri Lanka, and you can see Dondra there, and you can see that the eastbound and westbound traffic separation schemes run basically along that 1,000-meter contour. Off Dondra, they start at about 5 miles off the coast, and then there's about a 3-mile wide shipping lane going one way, and then a gap in between, and then the other. And that traffic separation scheme has been there since 1980, and so it's quite. It was one of the first traffic separation schemes. It's quite an old traffic separation scheme, and it's one of the busiest shipping lanes in the world. And it's the main Indian Ocean shipping lane. So probably about 100 ships a day, speeds up to 25 knots, container ships going past Dondra. So the data we can see here, the orange, are data from ships' automatic identification systems from their AIS, which gives the density of shipping there. So you can see from those orange, 74% of the traffic is using those traffic separation schemes. But you can also see a little bit further offshore, there's other two parallel lines. That's about 26% of the traffic that isn't using the traffic separation schemes, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. You can also see there's about 10% of the traffic that's going into the port at Colombo. That's what the traffic separation scheme off Dondra looks like. And these red dots here are whale sightings. So these are sightings from surveys that we did in 2014 and 2015, which I'll talk about in a little bit more detail later, and also from whale watching data. So you can see that this traffic separation scheme is basically goes straight through this area of very high whale density. As I said before, the traffic has increased 300% since the 1990s. And you can see exactly why there's a problem. You've got the area that is very good for whales, with the bathymetry that means that the waters are very nutrient rich, and you've got the shipping lanes that go straight through it. And if you look further offshore, you will see that actually there are very few whale sightings. And again, I'll talk about that a little bit more later. So because the area is very biologically productive, there's whales, and because there's whales, there's whale watching. And the whale watching industry has grown very quickly in the last few years, mostly out of Marissa. And there's many boats that come out of Marissa to whale watch. The whales are very close to shore. They're very reliable in their distribution. There's lots of them. And whale watching is a major contribution to Sri Lankan tourism. So Sri Lanka has become known as a really, really good area to come and watch whales. And it's become very popular. Now, there are some problems associated with whale watching. When you're out there and you're looking at the whale watching boats, they are kind of charging around, and it all kind of looks a bit crazy. It looks worse than it is simply because most of the boats are really quite slow, and so there's a limit to how much damage they can do. The whales can hear them coming from a long way off, whereas in some places, like in the Canary Islands, for example, they've got very, very fast whale watch boats, and they're more of a problem in terms of ship strikes for whales. The other thing that's going on in this area, so you've got big container ships, you've got whales, you've got whale watching boats, and the other thing that's going on is a lot of fishing activity, and a lot of the boats that are fishing are very small, and fish at night, and there's a lot of them. So it's an extremely busy area just out of Dondra. So you're getting an idea now of, as if, you know, a lot of you will know this already about how much is going on in the shipping lane. So there's obviously the threats to whales that we're concerned about, but there are significant threats to maritime safety as well, and having the traffic separation scheme where it is, and having such large ships going through so fast. So there are concerns for whale watching vessels. So you can see this little whale watching vessel in quite a perilous situation here. And there are obviously concerns for coastal fishing vessels, a lot of which fish at night, and aren't necessarily going to be seen by the officer on watch of these large ships going through if they're going through at night. So there's a threat to whales, but there's also significant risk to human safety. We don't, so far, we're not aware of any accidents involving whale watching boats, but we're definitely aware of accidents involving small fishing vessels being hit by large ships. And here's a plot of data that we collected in 2014 and 2015, which shows our sightings of fishing boats overlaid across where the traffic separation scheme runs. So you can see that a lot of fishing boats are in the traffic separation scheme, or at least have to cross it. And they're not as fast as these container ships, and so there is considerable peril for them. And it's worth saying that all these survey data of the fishing boats were all during the daytime. So these are only vessels that we could see during the day, and obviously there's a lot of them fishing out there at night as well, which aren't recorded by this particular plot. So it's not surprising that the International Whaling Commission, in its strategic plan to mitigate the effects of ship strikes on cetacean populations, has identified the area south of Sri Lanka as a very high-risk area globally because of this overlap between concentrations of blue whales and one of the world's busiest shipping lanes. So it's become an area of considerable concern. And so the International Whaling Commission Scientific Committee reviewed all the scientific data, and the committee recommended that those data would support a proposal to maybe reroute the traffic separation scheme. And this was also highlighted to the International Maritime Organization, who agreed that a minor routing change could lead to a substantial reduction in risk. So the data that I've been talking about that we collected in 2014 and 2015, I'll just talk a little bit about them now for a couple of minutes. So there's been a number of research projects over the years in Sri Lanka, and there's a lot of people doing some excellent work and some very committed, dedicated people working off Sri Lanka. Our project was just collecting data in 2014 and 2015. And as I mentioned before, was highly collaborative. We were at sea with Raja and the whales, and we were working with the University of Ruhuna. So this is one of Raja and the whales whale watching boats, and it was extremely productive working with Raja and the rest of his crews. So what we decided to do was we had data that we know that there are whales in the shipping lanes, and mostly what the whale watch boats do, and where the whale watch boats data are from, is they go out to the first whales that they see, and then they stop and hang out with those whales because they're a whale watching operation. So they don't go any further than that offshore. So whilst we knew that there were whales in the shipping lanes, whales along the 1,000-meter contour, what we didn't know was what happened further offshore, and so if rerouting ships would really reduce the risk. So that's what we wanted to find out. So we had a very simple question: are there fewer whales further offshore than there are further inshore? So we designed some very simple surveys to hopefully give us some very simple answers. So what we did is we designed some north-south transects, which went 50 kilometers offshore. So we would drive straight lines in the boats off Raja's whale watch boat offshore, and then turn around and go back north again. And so we had a survey area that was 50 kilometers north to south and 150 kilometers east to west. And we were surveying these transect lines to see if there were fewer whales further offshore than there were inshore. And that's not something that has been done very much. Lots of people said to us, well, why are you going offshore to find whales? There aren't any whales offshore. But of course, that was what we wanted to find out. So as you can see from this photo here, that's me at the front there. It was sometimes quite hairy doing our survey lines, because when we were in the traffic separation scheme, those ships are really very large and they go very fast, and I think a lot of the time they don't see you. And it was quite sobering imagining being a small fishing boat at night with maybe very little in the way of lights, and thinking how it would be when you were seeing these absolutely massive container ships coming at a really significant speed, and you'd have a limited means of getting out of the way. So they were very interesting, the surveys, both in terms of the whales that we saw, but also in terms of understanding exactly how things are in the traffic separation scheme, which is very, very busy. So those were the surveys that we did in 2014 and 2015, and as I say, they were very simple surveys. We wanted a simple answer, and actually we got one. Because if you go back to this map that I was showing you earlier, the results of our surveys, that we did see lots and lots of whales further inshore. But then if you look at the red dots further offshore, there are really very few. So I just want to talk again for a minute about those more pale lines offshore that you can also see. And I mentioned about 74% of the transoceanic traffic uses the traffic separation schemes, and about 26% doesn't. And what we've seen happening increasingly over the last few years is that because of how busy it is, and the hazards that there are in the traffic separation scheme with whale watch boats and fishing boats and whales, a lot of container vessels and the large ships are now actually choosing to go further offshore. So they're not using the traffic separation schemes. So in a way, that's great news, in that it's solving the problem by itself without any official rerouting. But the problem with that is there's no set rules on which ships go east and which ships go west and exactly what route they take. So the issue with not having a proper eastbound and westbound lane is that your ships that are going further offshore in an unofficial shipping lane are not necessarily in going opposite directions, are possibly going in opposite directions to each other. So you do have a safety and collision risk now with the larger ships that aren't using the traffic separation scheme. But the reason they're not using it is because it's so hazardous in there now. So what do we do about it? We can't move the whales. The whales aren't going anywhere. They're there year round. It's the nutrient-rich waters that they need in order to feed on, and they live where they live. So if you can't move the whales, the proposal from the international community is to try to move the ships. So having done our surveys where we went further offshore to see how far we had to go until we weren't really seeing very many whales anymore, it was decided that if you could create a traffic separation scheme 15 nautical miles south of the current scheme, but also have an inshore traffic zone for ships that were using ports such as Colombo, then you could reduce the risk to blue whales by about 95%. And would also greatly reduce the risk to whale watching boats and fishing vessels. And it would improve the safety for large ships, already routing further offshore, which, as I mentioned, was 26% of the current traffic, by avoiding having two-way traffic. Now, in terms of what it would add to the journeys of these large ships transiting south of Sri Lanka, well, only about 9 miles from traffic coming from the Gulf of the west coast of India, or about 12 miles for traffic coming from Colombo. So it's not an awful lot in the context of these very, very long journeys that these ships are making. It will put the traffic very slightly further offshore, off Galle, and the inshore traffic zone could be used for traffic using Sri Lankan ports. So that was the proposal that came out of the work that we've done, and also the work that an awful lot of other people working in Sri Lanka have done over the years. So I need to stress how amazing a 95% risk reduction is. If you think of what they've done in California, for example, they rerouted the ships, but they haven't really reduced risk that much. And most areas in the world that they try and reroute ships, there's a limited amount that you can do because the ships still have to sort of weave their way around the whales, and the whales distribution is less predictable and less regular. So in Sri Lanka, it's a worry because it's a very big problem. You know, it's a very serious ship strike issue that's happening off Sri Lanka. But it's also unusual in that there is a solution which is reasonably straightforward and does deliver a potential huge risk reduction. And in conservation, you know, working as I do and as I know many of you here also do in conservation, we all know how hard it is to reduce human impacts and to genuinely reduce risk. And it's, you know, it's usually a very big deal, and you can work extremely hard on something for a very long time, and you feel like sometimes you haven't really made very much difference. But there is an opportunity here to, you know, both make a difference to the whales and make a difference to other people who are using Sri Lankan waters, such as fishermen. So in December 2018, the Marine Environment Protection Authority of Sri Lanka hosted a workshop to talk about this. It was called National Stakeholder Consultations, Maritime Activities off the Coast of Sri Lanka, the case of the blue whale population near Dondra Head. And this was organised by the International Maritime Organisation Technical Cooperation and Marine Environment Division and supported by the government of Sri Lanka. And some of the people who are involved in our collaborative project were present at that, as well as other scientists working on blue whales and the marine environment in Sri Lanka. And the workshop considered routing options and made recommendations for follow-up work. And the idea was to look at any possible economic impacts. But we're not actually aware of any further action having been taken on that since that workshop. So what does the shipping industry think of this? What does the shipping industry think of rerouting the traffic separation scheme? You know, is it a problem for them? Well, no. As I said, 26% of ships are already going further offshore and not using the traffic separation scheme. And there's very little that large places is quite narrow, so there's not much potential for deviating. By the time a whale is seen surfacing in the path of a ship, it's usually too late for a ship to make any avoiding action. You know, whales do generally avoid ships, but often this doesn't happen, and we're not really sure why sometimes they can avoid ships and sometimes they can't. So as the International Whaling Commission concluded, keeping ships and whales apart is the best way of doing it, and the international shipping industry is very supportive of doing that off Sri Lanka, and wrote a letter to the Prime Minister to say this in 2017. The 90% of container shipping represented by the World Shipping Council wrote this letter saying that they would support rerouting the TSS south of Dondra. So, in summary, the situation in southern Sri Lanka is one of the highest risk areas for ship strikes. And as we've seen, there's several areas in the world that have problems with ship strikes. Some have started to deal with it through rerouting their ships and slowing down their ships. Areas such as California and Bay of Fundy and Panama. Some have a problem and a recognised problem and are yet to take any measures to do anything about it, such as the Hellenic Trench in Greece with the Eastern Mediterranean population of sperm whales. the situation in Sri Lanka is a very high risk area for ship strikes on whales and collisions with other water users. And there are, also serious concerns for maritime safety. But it is a clear case of a very high risk area, but with actions that could be taken to reduce the risk. And that's what's very hopeful and optimistic about this situation, is that whilst it's quite a serious problem, it's also something that does have possible solutions in a way that a lot of welfare and conservation problems, such as bycatch in fisheries, for example, which is something I also work on, that's been a very intractable situation for a very long time, and it's very difficult to see ways of solving those problems. But this is a situation where there is actually quite a possibility of really improving things for the whales and for fishermen and whale watch boats. And the rerouting of the shipping is supported by the shipping industry and the scientific community. Obviously, I'm just a scientist. I'm not a policymaker. I'm not Sri Lankan, and I don't work for the International Maritime Organization or anything like that. So it's obviously up to Sri Lanka what it does. But from the point of view of a scientist and someone who's very interested in whale conservation and welfare, and particularly interested in blue whales, there does seem to be some way forward out of what is currently quite a difficult problem. So I would like to thank you all very much indeed for inviting me to talk, and for listening, and for giving me your attention. Those are my emails if anyone is interested in contacting me, if you have any questions after the question and answer, which I understand will follow this. I'd like to thank, obviously, all my collaborators. I'm a very small part of both our project and all the general work that goes on in Sri Lanka, and also those who've contributed material and photographs for this presentation. So thank you all very much, and I understand that we've got time for some questions, which hopefully some people have been putting in the chat box. So many thanks to you all, and I look forward to hearing your questions. You're muted.
Thank you very much, Susannah, for that very engaging presentation. Needless to say, extremely vital for us. Being located in such a, should I say, sensitive, also should I say, so close to where there would be very high density of shipping traffic, and these fantastic mammals, the blue whales. So how I will do this is, as you said, there'll be questions popping up on the chat. I'll try and group them into areas which probably point in the same direction if I can, so that we'll probably be able to get in an idea of what everyone is asking, in case we're not able to cover all the questions that have been asked. But to kick this off, I'm seeing a question that's popping up here, quite relevant. Do you expect more ship whale collision in future with the newly built harbour in the south, as in Hambantota, when it's in full operation?
Yeah, it's difficult to know. I suspect that a lot of the traffic, because the traffic that's going into the new port and the port of Colombo, which is obviously up and running already, which is about 10% of the traffic that passes the coast, a lot of those ships are going slower because they're not on a long ocean passage. And so they are going to be, if there was a change in the shipping traffic, there would be some inshore lanes allocated, and they would probably have speed restrictions. But even at the moment, if nothing's done about the rerouting, a lot of those ships are going somewhat slower because they're on their way into port. So I think it potentially could cause problems, but those inshore ships that are going in and out of port are potentially less of a problem anyway. But certainly there will be more ships, and if there are more ships in an area where there's whales, that is potential for increasing the problem.
Thanks, Susannah. Yeah, let me just. How many whales? To the audience, it would be appreciated if you could just pop up your questions. Make use of the opportunity. I'm sure there's much that you would like to ask. So do give it some thought and just pop it up on the screen. How many whales are estimated to be in Sri Lanka? Let me just read this out. If the shipping community is agreeable to the movement of shipping lanes, how do you think it's? Oh, I guess it hasn't been implemented. Yes, which is a question why. But probably we could get to the very basic question asked above as to what the type of population is like, and then get on to the second one if there's an answer, Susannah. But
yeah, we don't have a population estimate. So from the surveys that we did in 2014 and 15, we estimated that from the we did what called line transect surveys, so we could come up with some population estimate for the area that we surveyed, which was 50 kilometres by 150 kilometres, north, south, and east-west. And for that area that we surveyed, we came up with an estimate of about 300 animals. So that's just that area, and that's just those 2 years of surveys. But an actual population estimate isn't available for the whole of Sri Lanka. So that's sort of as good as what we've got at the moment. But that's for really quite a small area. That's a very high density of animals. On to your next question about what's the process for the shipping lanes being moved, and why hasn't it happened yet? So the process would be analogous with what has happened in Panama that I was talking about, that the Panamanian government, and so the Sri Lankan government, would propose moving the shipping lanes, and they would do so with the support of the International Maritime Organization, which would provide help and guidance in terms of where those shipping lanes would be moved and how they would be rerouted. But the request has to come from the Sri Lankan government because it's in Sri Lankan waters.
do you think? Yeah, sorry, Karen.
No, go ahead.
No, so the rest of the question to follow up from there, which I thought was is there anything more that can be done in that case, Susannah?
So, from our perspective as scientists, obviously scientists will always tell you, oh, we need to do more research, we need to find out more information, because scientists love to say that. In terms of the data that we've got, we are reasonably happy that while we could go and do more whale surveys, and they're extremely useful for finding out about general whale ecology and finding out more about blue whales in Sri Lanka, which are still quite poorly understood in a lot of ways. In terms of moving the shipping lane, we don't feel at this point there's more research that we need to do on that very specific question. It's really a case now of the Sri Lankan government wanting to do it. And I can't really speculate on why they are not keen. Other people may have their ideas, and there may be economic concerns, which I don't think are particularly well founded, because a lot of the ships going past aren't going to stop at Sri Lanka anyway. They're on international routes, and they're going to go past whatever happens wherever the shipping lanes are. So no, it's a matter now really for policymakers in Sri Lanka to decide what they want to do. I mean, it is interesting that, as I was saying, that TSS was one of the very first to be set up in 1980. So it's 40 years old now and is probably due for some kind of reassessment anyway, because the criteria that people used 40 years ago to set up traffic separation schemes are different from what they are now. So it's probably due for some kind of reevaluation anyway, irrespective of the whales and the risks to human safety.
Thank you. Thanks, Susannah. I see one here. There's mention that there are instances of collisions that probably go unreported. Is there a regulatory body monitoring these, and any reasons for it to go unreported, Susannah? Would you be able to share us some light?
So this is people that don't report ship strikes, I assume. There's no obligation to. There's no obligation to report whether you hit a whale or not. So as I mentioned early on in my talk, the IWC, the International Whaling Commission, has a database where people can report having hit a whale, but nobody is obliged to. And in most circumstances, people don't, as I say, people don't even know that they've hit a whale. If you're in an extremely large ship going quite fast, you wouldn't feel it, you wouldn't know.
Lovely. This discussion in 2018, Susannah, where exactly did it end, and can we pick it up, or can someone pick it up and try and push it through? Do you think there's potential for that?
Yeah, I mean, it ended it ended that I myself wasn't actually at the meeting. That more investigations would be done into, for example, the economic impact of moving the shipping lanes, and if there was any potential for economic impact, and that more work would be done, and that there would be more recommendations put together. And there hasn't really been any progress since then. Yes, I think it could be picked up again. Certainly, the International Maritime Organization is still very keen. And the World Shipping Council are still very keen. They've been extremely proactive and supportive. And so, yes, I think if the will was there amongst the regulatory authorities in Sri Lanka, yes, I think it could well be picked up again. Yeah.
Fantastic. Okay. A little more about whales. I've heard that blue whale population in Sri Lanka is unique because they don't migrate. Is this correct? And can this behavior be seen elsewhere?
No, it's really interesting because obviously they can't go north, but they don't seem to go south either. Whales tend not to. This isn't, across the board, but when migratory whales tend not to like crossing the equator, and so they can't go north and they don't go south. So yes, they're a non-migratory population, and they appear to be there year round, and it is very, very unusual. So there are some other small isolated populations of large whales that don't go very far, but it's very unusual. Yeah, and it's a very, very interesting situation in Sri Lanka.
Now, interestingly, Susannah, we've just like with the air traffic, where we've seen some serious reduction in air traffic, obviously with the current situation with COVID. Has there been a similar reduction in maritime traffic? And would you be seeing some sort of upside in pollution and less strikes and casualties in that instance?
Yeah, that's something that we want to do. Actually, is we want to do an analysis on the automatic identification system data for the last few months to see whether there has been any significant reduction from people that we've talked to within the shipping industry. No, not really very much, because a lot of the shipping traffic is commercial rather than people going on their holidays or on business trips or whatever, and the demand for consumables hasn't really abated over the last few months. So although we haven't done the analysis on those data, I don't think there has been much of a drop in shipping traffic.
Interesting. Now here's an interesting one, Susannah. Any comments?
They're all interesting.
Yeah, very interesting one, should I say, and relevant. Any comments on acoustics and how serious seismic sound pollution can be?
So on seismic, yeah. So, right. So seismic is a real problem for whales. So shipping noise is a big problem for whales. It's loud and it's continuous and it's low frequency, and so it's within the bandwidth that they use to communicate with each other over very long distances. And seismic is, in theory, not such a problem because there are blasts and then there are gaps in between the blasts. And some people do theorize that whales are able to communicate and hear each other in the gaps between the seismic blasts. But actually, the way the sound propagates, there isn't really very much gap in between the blasts. And if you think about it in terms of a human analogy, trying to talk in between blasts of noise or hear someone in between blasts of noise is a fairly difficult undertaking. So it's definitely a problem. When I've been doing work listening to large whales in the Antarctic, which is a very, very quiet environment normally, if we've encountered ships doing research seismic, we just haven't been able to work anymore. We've just had to stop until we were further away from the ships. And this is ships like a couple of 100 miles away. You can hear them doing seismic research and you can't hear the whales anymore. So it's very, very loud and it's low frequency and it propagates for a really long way.
And in terms of, thanks, Susannah. In terms of species risk and collisions, would it be sharks, dolphins, whales? What are the species that you would feel that obviously the whale is at highest risk? Any other species that?
Yeah, for ship strikes, it is mainly the large whales. Smaller cetaceans, so dolphins, for example, don't tend to get hit so much. And species that aren't air breathers, so don't have to come to the surface for air and are smaller, again, they tend not to suffer so badly from ship strikes. They tend more to be subject to other threats, such as fisheries bycatch. So it's really the large whales that that are the biggest sufferers from ship strikes.
Okay. Okay. Is the vocalization of blue whales of Sri Lanka adapted to shipping noise? Is there any way of telling, or if that is the case, is there any correlation?
There is no way of telling, but I suspect not. I mean, we have done acoustic work off Sri Lanka, and it's very difficult because it's very noisy and you can't really hear the whales. I guess they're better at hearing each other than we are at hearing them because, you know, they're conspecifics. But no, to our knowledge, maybe they possibly vocalize louder than they otherwise would, but we don't really have any baseline data on that. And they possibly try and vocalize more like in between the noise, but with shipping noise, that's a bit difficult because it's a continuous noise. No, I mean, obviously, you know, animals can evolve to adapt to all sorts of things, but there hasn't really been that level of shipping off Sri Lanka for long enough for them really to have been able to adapt in any way. But there is some evidence in some areas that animals do vocalize louder if there's more noise. But no, I mean, I think it's very difficult for them.
Sure. So there's been a lot of publicity and things written on the naval exercises and their involvement in waters like this and casualties as a probably result of the sound, of the sonic. Any comment on that one?
Yeah, so Navy sonar tends to be higher frequency. And the animals that seem to suffer particularly from that are deep diving, the real deep divers such as beaked whales. And the theory with that is that naval sonar is very loud and very sudden onset, and that very deep diving animals that would normally surface very, very gradually so that they don't get the effect of the bends that human divers get, they surface much too quickly and cause internal organ damage from having surfaced from a very deep depth to very shallow much too quickly, because the theory is they get a fright from the naval sonar. So yeah, that's another problem for whales, but it tends to be more the deep diving species such as beaked whales, and some of the blackfish that get affected by naval sonar. So yeah, I mean, you'll be aware, and a lot of people here will be aware of the mass strandings that have been recorded associated with naval exercises. It's really difficult because obviously it's always very hard to get information out of the military on when they have conducted exercises and what sonar they've been using, because obviously it's military secrets and they don't like to talk about it. So it can be quite hard to get data on that. We've had last year we had a mass stranding of beaked whales all the way up the Irish and Scottish coasts. And it's been very hard to find out what the cause of that was, but we suspect it was military sonar.
Sure. So here, see the I'm just combining a couple of them. We have the IMO and the international shipping community, who you would say, if I understood, were agreeable to moving the shipping lanes. In which case, Susannah, do you think there's more to be done, or is it why exactly hasn't it happened, or is it again because of collaboration that needs from governments and policymakers as well?
Yeah, it's now I guess the international communities in terms of scientists and people such as the World Shipping Council are, they're fairly content with what they would like to see happen, and so it is really a matter now for the Sri Lankan government to decide that they'd like that to happen. Yeah.
So, and okay. And MIPA, you said you've been working with MIPA, so MIPA, I guess, would be again a key stakeholder in this.
Yeah, no, absolutely, yeah. And there's various, government departments that we've been talking to over the years about trying to make this happen, and it's just finding the right process and getting some momentum behind it to try and make it happen, and and making sure that people are content that there won't be any economic impact, for example, by moving the TSS. I mean, it's something that we feel quite confident in suggesting, but obviously, the Sri Lankan government has to be content with that as well.
Sure. Say another one. If the whales here are isolated or confined to these waters, would there be a dilution or the genetic balance being degraded if that is the case because of non-migration?
Possibly. I mean, they never have been. So, I mean, I'm not a geneticist, and I that's not a sort of area I'm going to walk into.
Yeah,
they always have been a reasonably small isolated population, and there are quite a lot of populations of cetaceans in the world that are just naturally like that. I mean, obviously, their numbers were greatly reduced by illegal Soviet whaling, which won't have helped their genetic diversity. But it's not something we know very much about.
Fantastic. Probably have a couple of minutes more. Is there anyone who wants to pop in a last question or maybe two? Not seeing
anything. If anyone thinks anything later and you're sorry you didn't ask me, you can still see those email addresses are up there on the screen, and please feel free to contact me always, or any comments or suggestions, or I'm very aware I've got a Sri Lankan audience here who a lot of them will know an awful lot more about this than I do, so any suggestions or comments would be extremely useful.
Okay, I think I'm not seeing anything popping up. Susannah, so thank you very much for taking the time and being with us this evening. That has been very enthralling, different, and wish you all the best in your work. And let's see whether we, how this will pan out. And thank you again.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me.
For that wonderful presentation.
Thank you.
Thanks. Good night to you, and good night to everyone.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.